with another one of our Wolff Responds. I want to talk today about immigration, and in particular, the relationship between immigration on the one hand and capitalism as a system on the other. Of course, migration precedes capitalism. It's been something that has characterized the human species, as indeed it has characterized other species from as long as we have any history. So capitalism is not the only reason or the only context for migration. But over the last 300 years, as the capitalist system grew from its origins in England as a dominant economic system to its globalization in the last century and at the present, capitalism has been an important shaper of virtually every major migration we know of. And I want to give you some examples. And I want to be upfront with one of my basic reasons for doing this. In modern times, particularly in Europe and in North America, by which I'm politely meaning the United States, but it applies a bit to Mexico and even to Canada, there's a tendency to look upon migration as though the countries into which the migrants go have no responsibility for the migration, that they think of themselves as either welcoming or resisting something that is happening to them from the outside and for which they have no responsibility beyond choosing between welcoming and not welcoming. And clearly, in Europe for decades now, in the United States for quite a while, and especially with the Trump GOP regime, the not welcome mat is what is being put out. And again, always this presentation as though the capitalisms that are turning the door shut against immigrants are doing this because they don't want something that is external to them to intrude. My position is, very importantly, the opposite. That is, capitalism has an immense responsibility, and the leading capitalist countries especially, for the migrations, for causing them and not being merely the passive recipients or not of something for which they don't have responsibility. So let me give you a very brief historical proof of what I'm saying. Much of the world's movement of people began in the capitalist era with the decision of capitalist countries, European, North American, and beyond, to develop colonies, to take over other parts of the world, in Asia, Africa, Latin America especially, and use them and change them so they served their colonial masters. This often meant drawing boundaries that were convenient to the capitalist colonial countries, but not to the people they took over. Boundaries which meant that people who normally moved from place A to place B couldn't do so anymore because a boundary between the French and the Spanish colonial empires, or the British or the American colonial empires, stood in the way. There was an interesting beginning, if you like, of how migrations were shaped by capitalist colonialism. But of course it went much further. In those colonies where the colonial power decided to settle its own citizens, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Kenya, I could go on, it meant literally forcing migrations of the people who lived where the colonial power wanted to settle its own citizens to make room for those citizens. The Kikuyu were moved off of the Central Highlands in Kenya to allow British folks to settle. The various tribes in South Africa were moved to allow the Boer and the English to settle where they wanted to. And we know what happened to the Aboriginal people in Australia and New Zealand. And we know of the ethnic cleansing / genocide of the native peoples in North America as the colonial powers moved in to Canada and the United States. Mass migrations caused by capitalist drives for profit that led to the colonization, of much of the rest of the world. But we don't have to go back far in history to see it as well. Let me give you some further examples. The United States has been the dominant colonial power in Latin America at least since the establishment of the so-called Monroe Doctrine back in 1830. Whether the United States operates a direct colonial regime, as it did in Caribbean islands of various sorts, or the indirect dominance that we know of for the entire continent, the United States bears major responsibility for the economic developments that did and did not happen there, which in turn led to the migrations of people, including those in recent decades coming up from Central America, from Mexico. Anyone who knows anything about the NAFTA agreement signed in 1994 and 5 between Mexico, the United States, and Canada knows that it had something to do with the massive migration of Mexican people northward. Capitalism is not the passive recipient, it's the active cause. A last example. In 1970, the population of Detroit, Michigan, auto capital of the United States, roughly 2 million people. Today, under 700,000 people. What caused the majority of the people of Detroit to leave, to migrate elsewhere? Answer, capitalism did that. The drive of 3 auto companies, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, to make more money somewhere else compared to what they did in Detroit, led them to leave, to go to Canada, to Mexico, to China. You know the story. They forced those people to leave by depriving the majority of the people of Detroit of a living, of a job, and of an income. The other places to which those people went might have treated them as an outside influx. But capitalism is as much an active cause of migration as anything else. The difference is, the point is, the problem is that capitalists are not required in a capitalist system to take any responsibility for the migrations they cause. When General Motors decides it's more profitable to shut down in Detroit and move to China, what are its obligations to the workers it fires, to the families of those workers, to the small stores that lived from the commerce of those workers? Nothing. No responsibility. So they do it. A rational calculus wouldn't permit jobs to be lost if the net cost of all of the dislocation was greater than the gains. But the gains are made by the profiteers and the losses are borne by the mass of the employees. And capitalism focuses on the first and ignores the second. Migration is a product of capitalism. Its difficulties, its sufferings, and its costs are part of capitalism, no matter how much capitalists would like to pretend otherwise.